Hey there, wire weaver. Welcome to part 2 of the Ride the Wave bracelet make-along series. Today we're going to finish the bracelet that we started last week in part 1. If you haven't already prepared your bracelet frame for weaving and final shaping, be sure to watch that video first. My name is Wendy, and I'm the wire weaver behind door 44. If you want to learn to make wire jewelry, this channel's for you. Don't forget to download the free project starter guide that goes along with this tutorial series. To grab the guide, go to door44studios.com/106. That will take you to the project resources page for this tutorial. If you need help locating tools or materials for your Ride the Wave bracelet, you'll find clickable shopping links here. The free project starter guide is in my resource library. If you're a returning user and you already have a password, just click on Resource Library right here at the top of the page and type in your password. If you're brand new to door 44, or if you forgot your password, click on Get a Password instead. Then complete and submit this form right here and you'll receive your password instantly. So before we get started today, let's talk a little bit about weaving patterns. I specified modified sumac weave in the written tutorial for the bracelet. That's the pattern that you see here. If you're not already familiar with that weave, I've linked a tutorial on your screen as well as in the description. This is my favorite weave. It's my go-to weave, the one that I start doing automatically before I've even really thought about what sort of weaving pattern I'm going to use. And I'm sort of trying to get out of the habit of just relying so heavily on this weave. I do love it, but you know, there comes a time when you just got to change things up, and that's what we're going to do today. Another great pattern alternative that looks beautiful on this bracelet is the basic figure 8 weave, which you can see here. I'll also link to that tutorial in the description and up here on the screen in the right hand corner, just in case you haven't already mastered that pattern. But today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I've decided to go completely off script and try a different weave pattern that I've never used on this design before. And this is just to demonstrate that you can always modify the weaving pattern on any of my designs. So let's get started. Weaving this bracelet band can be just a little bit tricky, so I'm going to show you a couple of tips that'll make it easier to weave. And one of those tips is to go ahead and split your core wires. We're going to separate them. They kind of tend to want to snap together, but if we separate them, we're going to be able to weave the majority of the band with these separated, and it's just going to make it faster and easier to weave. And then once we get close to the end, we'll go ahead and snap these back into place and finish our weave. And that gets a little bit tricky because you end up having to work around these curves. We'll talk about that when we get there. So for now, just go ahead and separate your two core wires. And then we're going to use a couple of tools that's going to make weaving a little bit easier. I use these Kumihimo bobbins. These are designed for cord jewelry, for like knotted braided cord, but they work beautifully for wire as well. And I do recommend that you go ahead and use these. They just really help with keeping your wire from kinking. It helps keep your wire under control. And then the other tool that we're going to use is, of course, my ring clamp. So to start weaving, I'm just going to go ahead and again, I'm going to separate my two core wires, and I'm going to start, I always start with my wire behind the bottom core wire. So I'm going to put my tail, I'm going to come up between the two core wires. I'm going to leave about, I don't know, about a 4-inch tail. You don't need a lot. And we're going to do a wrapping style. I'm not even going to call it a weave. This is more of a wire wrapping pattern. And I'm just going to do 5 single wraps around this bottom core wire. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And now that I've got that wrap anchored on there, I'm just going to go ahead and slide it back toward my hook. And I'm not going to go all the way. I want to go ahead and get my pattern going. So I'm going to do 5 single wraps on that lower core and 2 wraps around both core wires. And then I'm going to go back to 5 single wraps around the lower core wire. And like I say, this gets a little bit fiddly because you're trying to hang on to a very small bit of your hook here. But I just want to get that started enough to where I can slide it underneath the hook. Do you see how I did that? So now my wrap is inside the hook. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and clamp that hook in my ring clamp. So I'm just going to clamp on tightly to that hook and push my wedge in there. And the nice thing about these ring clamps is they hold on really securely to whatever you put in there. Okay, so I started out with 5 wraps on the bottom core wire and then 2 wraps around both core wires. And now I'm going to go back to doing 5 around the bottom. So I've already got 1. There's 2. 3. 4. And 5. And then we're going to do 2 wraps around both. And I'm just going to keep repeating that pattern until I get up to about an inch from where my loop is formed, the tail of that loop right there. So I'm going to weave up to about here, and then I'm going to put my core wires back together. We will snap them back into place and continue weaving the 2 together. All this time I've been weaving with these core wires separated, and as you can see, I've got a little bit of a twist here in my base because these wires are stacked on top of each other. So I'm going to go ahead and snap those together now, and we're going to straighten out our band. Get that twist out of there. And now, once you get to this point, it's a little bit trickier to weave. So you just sort of have to figure out exactly where you're going to put your wire and follow those curves around. So I'm going around this outer core wire, which is my bottom wire. You see how I did that and how I figured that out? And you just kind of have to get in there and work your way between those curves. Now the nice thing about this particular weave that I chose here, this wrap I should say, is it's not a super complicated wrap, and I don't have to go around just the top core wire. So that actually saves me a little bit of trouble because I don't have to weave in and around these curves, which you will have to do if you do either the figure 8 weave or the modified sumac weave. So again, I'm just doing 5 wraps around the bottom core wire and 2 wraps around both wires. So that's 4 and 5 around my bottom core. And then I'm going to go 1, 2 around both wires. And like I say, this is an easier wrap to do on this particular design, because once you get to this point where you have to have your core wires together, it does get pretty dicey weaving in and out and around these wires. Now it can be done, you just have to go slowly and carefully, and you just have to keep track of which wire you're working on. So this longer wave here is our top core wire, and this tighter curl is our bottom core wire. So as you're weaving, just follow your wire and pay attention to where you need to feed your weaving wire through. And then just continue your weave. And slowly and carefully work your wire through the curves here. It's going to want to catch on that curl. See how it did that? You just gotta get into a flow. It takes a little bit of practice, but it's so worth it in the end. I think it's just easier to form your bracelet frame first and then weave. It does get a little challenging here at the end, but I think you ultimately end up with better results than if you do all your weaving and then form these curves and your hook. But that's an option, so keep that in mind. You can always approach any design, whether it's my design or somebody else's, or you're doing something on your own. Figure out what the best approach is for you and go with that. Don't feel like you have to follow, tutorials step by step, word by word, because not everybody has the same sense of how to put things together, how things should flow. I like my process that I use for this bracelet because, again, I really like to finish these core wires and get them looking really good before I do any weaving. But sometimes doing the weaving first is an easier approach to take. So you do what works best for you. And if there's anything I can do to help you, if you run into problems here, please don't hesitate to ask me questions, because I do know that this can be challenging, getting this bit of weaving done here. Does take some time and some effort. But again, I think it's so worth it once you get it done in the end, because this bracelet is just a fun piece, and it's, as simple as it is, it's pretty unique. And again, if your core wires start twisting on you, just straighten them out. I'm going to go ahead and put my ring clamp back on. It's just a little bit easier to hang on to this and keep even tension, and you've got a lot to focus on while you're weaving, so give yourself a break. Figure out how you can do some of this stuff easier, make things easier on yourself. And now, as we start approaching the point where our waves are going to cross over the weave, I'm going to start looking at where I'm going to lash these waves down. So you need to start planning. Once you get close, you get enough weaving done that you're approaching those waves, you need to start thinking about where do you want to lash them. And I do recommend that you lash both waves down, because we don't want them to catch on anything and snag on clothing or something and get bent. So here we are. I'm getting right to the tip of that wave there. You see how it's just under where I'm weaving, or just over where I'm weaving? So I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and cut my weaving wire. So I'm going to leave myself about a foot. Where I'm at in the weave is I just finished the 2 wraps around both core wires. And at this point I should be coming up around that lower wire. But look where my wave is crossing. It's up there around that top wire. So I think what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to come around behind both core wires, and then I'm going to go down. Let's see if I can get in there. It's a little tight. I'm going to feed my wire between the core wires, and I'm going to capture that tail. So I want to get, you see how I have those wraps right there? I'm going to go ahead and capture that tail right there, and I'm going to do 2 wraps. Pull that nice and snug. And that's going to hold that tail there very securely. So at this point, and this is all, like, no 2 bracelets are going to be alike, so you sort of have to just figure this part out as you go with each bracelet. Everyone's going to be unique. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie off my wire here, now that I've got that tail lashed down nice and securely. And then I'm going to come back with a separate piece of weaving wire, and I'm going to lash down this curl and make sure everything's bound together. So I'm going to go ahead and take my ring clamp off, and I'm going to pull these wires nice and snug. So you see now, if you look at the back here, so we finished the 2 wraps around both wires, and then I did 2 wraps around this top wire and this wire tail. And I have that nice, that's pinned down nice and tightly there. So at this point, I'm going to feed this weaving wire through that gap between the tail and the core wire in the back. I'm just going to pull that snug. Try not to get any kinks in your wire. I've got a little bit of a kink trying to work its way in here, and I'm going to see if I can avoid that. Come on through there. There we go. All right, so I got that through there once. I'm going to go through that same gap again. So I'm feeding it right between the tail and the core wire. And then I'm going to pull that nice and tight. And I want to get at least 2 wraps here around these binding wraps before I break my tail. One more time. Here we go. I'm just going to press those together. Get them nice and tight and neat. You see that? And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and break this weaving wire tail. So tug, swirl, and break. And then we can also go ahead and break off this tail here at the beginning. So again, whenever I coil wires, I always press with my thumbnail and get that core wire pressed as tight against the core wire as I can before I break it. And that just helps keep things nice and snug. All right, let's straighten out our band a little. Make sure our loops are nice and tight. Okay, so now the next thing we need to do is lash this down. You see how that wants to pop up? So we want to make sure that that is tied down tightly. And I think for this guy, what we're going to do, so I may have to bind this in 2 places. Let's see here. Yeah, I feel like that piece is just going to be a little bit stubborn, so we're going to use 26 gauge wire to bind this tail. And I'm just going to cut a piece about, oh, that's probably about 9-10 inches maybe. And I probably won't need all of that, but I'm going to start there. Now I'm going to come up between these 2 core wires again, between the 2 core wires over both waves. And then I'm going to come again up between the core wires. Let's get 2 nice snug wraps there. Okay, I'm going to come up one more time. And now I'm going to bind these two on the top. So I'm coming up on this side of the wire. Can you see that? So I'm going to go through this direction. I'm going to feed that through that gap between the two wires and pull that nice and snug. And I'm going to do that 2 more times so that I get 2 binding wraps. So I'm just going under and around those loops twice. I'm pulling that nice and snug. And then those 2 wraps there. Get everything nice and neat. And then I'm gonna break that binding wire. Okay, that takes care of one tail, and then we've got this other tail here on the back. So I'm gonna do the same thing, only I'm gonna do it right here where these wires cross between the 2 band wires and the loop wires. So just feed that through that gap. Can you see where I'm feeding that wire through? Right there. I'm going to pull that nice and snug. And then I'm going to go around 2 wraps again. You can do 2 or 3, whatever you think looks good. I like to use 2. I think it looks nice and neat. And anytime I try to use 3, I feel like there are just too many wraps there. But just get them nice and neat and lined up next to each other. And pull that wire tail snug. And then I just kind of make sure everything is where I want it to be with my nails. Get everything lined up nice and neatly. And then again, I'm going to break that wire. Now this is 26 gauge wire, and notice that I break it using the same technique that I use to break my weaving wire. And that tail did not break quite where I wanted. It actually broke a little long, but that's okay. It's in the back. It's not going to catch on anything. And now let's look at this tail here. Notice I still have a little bit of movement there. I don't want that to catch on anything, so I'm actually going to bind these 2 wire tails together. And again, I'm going to use this 26 gauge wire for that. And I'm going to go between the 2 core wires again. So we're going to bind these 3 wires right here. I'm going to bind the 2 front wires together, and I'm going to bind them to this the back bottom wire. So I'm coming up between those 2 core wires and pull that nice and snug. And I'm just going to go around there one more time. So I'm going to make 2 wraps around all 3 of those wires, and then I'm going to come up. And I'm just going to use my flat nose pliers to kind of pull that wire snug because my hands are really slippery today. It's hot out, and do not have a good grip with my fingers. And then once again, I'm going to come up. So I'm coming up. See, this wire is coming up right next to those 2 wraps. And I'm going to go right that gap between the 2 wires there. And pull that wire snug. And then I'm going to make 2 wraps. Again, I'm going to use my flat nose pliers for this because it's easier to get a grip. Kind of keep everything as neat and tidy as you can. And there's no really right or wrong way to do this. The trick, of course, is just to get everything looking neat and tidy. snug. And now I can break that binding wire. And that one broke cleanly. And then for this tail back here, again, I'm going to do the same thing. So I always come through on the side that my wire is coming out on. So it's coming out on the left side of these two wraps. So I'm going to pass it through from left to right. Whenever your wire starts getting bent and you need it, it's not cooperating with you, just use your nylon jaw pliers to straighten out the wire. It'll be much more cooperative. There we go. Okay, so as I was saying, I always like to go pass through from whatever side my weaving wire is coming out on. So it was coming out on the left, so I went from left to right, passing through this gap here. And what that does is it pulls that wire up tight next to the whatever ties you're binding. So you just get a much cleaner look than if you go the opposite direction, because then you're going to get it to cross over, and your two little binding wraps won't be positioned where you really want them. You kind of want those in the middle of the point where you're binding. So I got my first wrap, I'm doing the second one. Pull that nice and tight and snug. And now I can break that wire off. And there we go. So now everything is bound down nice and tightly. Notice that, this wire is not moving anymore. This tail is nice and secure. That's what we want. We want everything stable and secure before we start forming our bracelet into its final shape. And that's what we're going to do next. Okay, so everything is bound nice and tightly, and our band is pretty straight. It's not super straight, but that's okay. Once you start forming it around the bracelet mandrel, it's going to straighten out a little bit, and it's not going to look so crooked. This isn't ideal. I do like it a little straighter, but for some reason I kind of tweaked it a little bit while I was doing this wrap. This isn't a wrapping pattern that I'm super familiar with, so it felt a little awkward while I was doing it, and I probably used too much tension on that, and that's why it's not super straight. But we're going to go ahead and start forming our mandrel, or forming on our mandrel. Now, I like this wave to be pretty much in the center of my bracelet, and I'm using an oval mandrel. I don't know if you can see this here. Let's see, I'm not going to be able to get my mandrel. So this is an oval shaped mandrel. I prefer oval shaped bracelets. You can do round or oval. Actually, there are lots of shapes of mandrels out on the market. You can also just form this by hand. If you don't have a mandrel, you can use any kind of round object that you have, like a pill bottle or a rolling pin. You can find lots of things around your house that you can use as bracelet mandrels. So I'm just going to go ahead and center this on my mandrel because I want this to be the front of the bracelet. And then I'm just going to start bending the band around. Now I'm not too worried at this point about getting everything centered perfectly and sized for my bracelet size. I just want to get it formed into a bracelet, rough bracelet shape. So you see that? And now I'm gonna go ahead and hook that on. And I'm just going to bend it a little bit by hand and kind of get things situated. So, not perfect yet, but we've got a rough shape going. And now I'm just going to press it onto my mandrel. Actually, let me turn this around. So I'm just going to bring this, push it down on my mandrel until I get it roughly where I think it should be, where it should fit. And you can see that loop there is sticking up quite a bit. So now that I have a sense of where this is going to be on my mandrel, I'm going to go ahead and loosen that. I'm going to keep my thumb here, mark that position so I know where to put it. And I'm going to open my bracelet again. So we know we're right about here is where we want that. And I'm going to grab my soft mallet. And mine is rubber on one side and nylon on the other. You can get lots of different soft mallets. There's rawhide, there's nylon, there's lots of different materials out there. I'm just going to go ahead. Let's see, this is a little bit tricky to do on camera. I'd rather have this flat on my bench, but I'm just going to go ahead and hammer that a little bit. I just want that to form around the bracelet mandrel so that it's not sticking straight up the way it was. And then I'm also going to, so when I did that, this is now flat, but my tail, can you see that tail piece is kind of sticking up a little bit there? So I'm just going to gently tap that down. I want that to form to the bracelet shape. Okay, and now that that's done, we can reconnect this, and you can see we're already looking better. It's still not quite a perfect bracelet shape. So now I'm going to hook it back together, and I'm just going to press it down on my mandrel. This bracelet actually turned out a little large. It was a 7, it measured about 7¼ inches the last time we measured it. And then I'm just going to gently tap. And notice I'm using the rubber side of the mallet. That's the softer side. And because I have weaving, I definitely want to use the softer side of the mallet. I don't want any hard surfaces making contact with my weaving wire because that could potentially break your weave. Let's measure it and see how long this bracelet ended up. You can buy bracelet mandrels that are gauged, you know, sort of like a ring gauge. Oh, nope, that's a 7-inch bracelet. Look at that. It came in right around 7 inches. 7¼ So it ended up right where we measured it earlier. In the last video, when I measured this band, it was looking like it was going to be about 7¼ inches, and that's exactly what it ended up being. So this is just going to be a little bit larger than a small bracelet. It's between a small and a medium. And if you downloaded the free project starter guide, there's a bracelet chart there, a bracelet size chart that gives you kind of an idea of what standard bracelet sizes are. And this one is somewhere about halfway between a small and a medium. So there we go. That's all done. It's shaped, formed. Now I like mine a little bit more oval shaped, so I will often, you know, after I've shaped them on the mandrel, I'll go ahead and kind of form them a little bit more by hand as well. I'm going to press this down a little bit and until I get a nice true oval shape. I like that a little bit better. And this guy is ready for patina and polish. So that is done. And here's a look at the 3 different weave patterns that I've used on this bracelet. So this is modified sumac. This is my favorite weave, and it's the one that I originally specified for this tutorial. And I think this bracelet looks great with this weave. This is the basic figure 8 weave, and I really love the way this weave looks too. I think I actually like this one a little bit better because I like the way that it shows off the definition of the core wires, and you have that nice deep channel there. It just adds a little bit more texture and interest to this bracelet. So that's the basic figure 8 weave. This is the modified sumac weave. And of course this is the 5 and 2 wrap. So I did 5 wraps around the bottom core wire and then 2 wraps around both core wires. You can do any 2 wire wrap that you want to do, any 2 wire weave or wrapping pattern, whatever you like best, go ahead and use that. Isn't this bracelet just the perfect summer accessory? I hope you enjoyed making your own Ride the Wave bracelet and that you'll wear it proudly. If you'd like to learn how to patina and polish your new bracelet, I have a tutorial for that process as well. Just click the link in the upper right corner of your screen or look for it below in the description. Until next week, wire weaver, go make something beautiful.